Well, hello, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas, and we're continuing our study in the book of 1 Samuel. We left David in chapter 27 seeking refuge among the Philistines. Of course, you know the Philistines are the enemy of God's people. And we've also seen David rise in our study to higher degrees of character in spite of different temptations to be less than the man after God's heart that the book tells us that he is. But we've also seen Saul, Israel's first king, sink lower and lower into suspicion, into paranoia, and even into outright sin. These final chapters of 1 Samuel are a lot different than the beginning chapters. At the very beginning, we saw a gifted baby to whom God spoke directly. Now in these final chapters, we see a forsaken king to whom God refuses to speak or even to listen to. But we also have the promise of a better king in David. But David still has some testing to go through. And right now, he's in the midst of the enemy. David is among the enemy, among the Philistines. And Saul, we're going to see, has, as if it were possible, a new low to which to sink. And he's going to do that by visiting someone who the law that as Israel's king held was forbidden to even allow to exist. Saul visits a medium in 1 Samuel chapter 28, and we're going to see his reasons for doing so in the first several verses. Let's start reading 1 Samuel 28, beginning in verse 1. It says, "Now it came about in those days that the Philistines gathered their armed camps for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, 'Know assuredly that you will go out with me in the camp, you and your men.' And David said to Achish, 'Very well. You all know what your servant can do.' So Achish said to David, 'Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life.' Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had lamented him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And David had removed from Saul had removed from the land those who were mediums and spiritists. So the Philistines gathered together and came and camped in Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel together, and they camped in Gilboa. When Saul saw the camp of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. When Saul inquired of Yahweh, Yahweh did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, 'Seek for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her.' And his servant said to him, 'Behold, there is a woman who is a medium at Endor.'" We see Saul, who has reason for trepidation. After all, the Philistines are a formidable foe, and they are gathering against him. And Saul himself is a seasoned warrior, and yet he looks at this enemy army and he trembles in fear. He has a lot of reason to, because God has left him. We'll find out where that has been driven home time and time again. But we see Saul's gathering dread. The Philistines and the Israelites, they gather for this big battle at Mount Gilboa. But little does Saul know that it's going to be his last. In spite of that, he has his own misgivings, part of which has to do with his ineffective prayer. Verse 6 says that Saul had inquired of Yahweh, but he did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. Saul desperately wants to know that God is on his side. And I think rather than seeking God's counsel, Saul is really seeking God's approvals. He wants to know that God is somehow going to help him, that he's going to be on his side. And all these attempts, whether by Urim or by prophet or by prayer, whatever it is, all these attempts to contact God, to communicate with him, are fruitless. None of the means of revelations that are provided for Saul provide anything for him. No answers. And why should they? I mean, Scripture reminds us again and again that God doesn't acknowledge the prayer of a sinful man. Read with me for a moment over in Job chapter 35. We usually consider Job's friends. We're going to Job 35. We usually consider Job's friends as being all wrong in everything that they said, but there is a truth, or at least there is a ring of truth, to something that Elihu, one of the last speakers, said to Job. In Job 35 and in verse 12, Elihu is speaking, and he makes a lot of insinuations against Job. But what he says to him concerning whether or not God will listen is actually validated in other parts of the Bible. In Job 35 and in verse 12, Elihu says, "There they cry out, but God does not answer because of the pride of evil men. Surely God will not listen to an empty cry, nor will the Almighty regard it." And I think the empty cry there is empty of righteousness. It's empty of relationship with God. And so for those who are opposed to God and yet they find themselves in a situation where they cry out to Him, God refuses to listen. I believe that Elihu was right on that because of what Psalm 34 tells us. Go with me now to Psalm 34. In Psalm 34 and in verse 15, David, apparently the author of this psalm, understood this. In Psalm 34 and in verse 15, David says, "The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and His ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against evildoers, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. The righteous cry, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." It's easy to see the difference, especially here in Psalm 34, of the kind of people that God listens to and doesn't listen to. And Saul, of course, is the kind of person that God is not going to listen to. Saul doesn't really care about being right with God. He cares about being exalted in the eyes of his people. And for Saul, going to find a medium is for him really the last straw. It's his last hope. He's at the end of his rope. He's got nothing else on which he can hang his hat. And so, desperate for some advice, even if it's from an ungodly person, Saul sinks lower into sin by seeking out a medium, a person who can communicate with the dead in spite of the illegality of it. In Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 31, and Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verses 10 through 11, the law of Moses forbids such a profession, forbids such a person to even live. And this is exactly the kind of attitude that Samuel had earlier rebuked Saul for. He said that the sin of divination was great before God in chapter 15 and in verse 23, and that's exactly what Saul is going after now. Divination, certainly not by God's priests, but by someone who can perhaps communicate with the dead. He's got some ulterior motives. There's somebody that Saul wants to contact, and he has success. In verse 8, it says, "Then Saul disguised himself by putting on other clothes and went, he and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night, and he said, 'Conjure up for me, please, and bring up for me whom I shall name to you.' But the woman said to him, 'Behold, you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off those who are mediums and spiritists from the land. Why are you then laying a snare for my life to bring about my death?' And Saul vowed to her by Yahweh, saying, 'As Yahweh lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing.' Then the woman said, 'Whom shall I bring up for you?' And he said, 'Bring up Samuel for me.' When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman spoke to Saul, saying, 'Why have you deceived me? For you are Saul.' The king said to her, 'Do not be afraid, but what do you see?' The woman said to Saul, 'I see a divine being coming up out of the earth.' And he said to her, 'Well, what is his form?' And she said, 'An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped with a robe.' And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and did homage." We'll stop there. This is occurring at night, verse 8 says, And of all the night scenes that are in the Bible, this is certainly one of the darker ones. And this woman's apprehensiveness is understandable. After all, her profession is illegal, but apparently she was practicing it. Saul's servants knew that she was available for the job, so she must have been doing it, although secretly. And she's got some reservations. She doesn't recognize Saul yet, but she tells him, "What are you doing trying to trap me into this? Saul has already made his mark by cutting off such people from the land." And she knew what the punishment for her profession was. It was death, Exodus 22 verse 18 declares. Still, even though she is probably practicing her craft in secret, I doubt if she really believed how successful she would be. The woman's success in bringing up bringing up Samuel, frightens her. First of all, she realizes it's Saul, the king himself, and the very guy who had gotten rid of others in her profession from the land, so she's probably fearing for her very life at this moment. But not only that, Samuel's sudden appearance seems to frighten her just as much. And so the question is always usually asked, did Samuel really come back from the dead? Well, there's some evidence in this very passage that seems to indicate that yes, because first of all, the text itself says so. The medium's reaction that's recorded for us seems genuine. She saw him, even though she was surprised and frightened by the apparition that had come up, or the vision. Later on, we're going to see where the words that Samuel speaks to Saul allude to a prior conversation that Saul and Samuel had. So there's that. But consider also that in life, Samuel was a prophet. And now, in death, it seems that his role as a prophet is as much a part of who he is in death as it was in life. And I think it's also important for us to consider this, that it wasn't this medium who conjured up Samuel. She seems just as surprised as anybody that he actually appeared. Samuel, in whatever form he appeared, was sent by God because God had one final message for Saul. He wanted to tell Saul his fate one more time. And so Samuel communicates. In verse 15 of 1 Samuel 28, it says, "Then Samuel said to Saul, 'Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?' And Saul answered, 'I am greatly distressed, for the Philistines are waging war against me, and God has departed from me and no longer answers me, either through prophets or by dreams. Therefore I've called you, that you may make known to me what I should do.' Samuel said, 'Why then do you ask me, since Yahweh has departed from you and has become your adversary? Yahweh has done accordingly as he spoke through me, for Yahweh has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, to David. As you did not obey Yahweh and did not execute his fierce wrath on Amalek, so Yahweh has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, Yahweh will also give over Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines. Therefore tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Indeed, Yahweh will give over the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." Saul's desperate plea in verse 15, as he words it, indicates his problem. He says, "God has departed from me." Of course, this happened long ago, way back in chapter 16, verse 14. It's reaffirmed again in chapter 18 and in verse 12. God has not been a part of Saul's life for a long time. And now Saul is at the end of his rope, and his only hope is that maybe Samuel might give him some valuable advice one last time. But if God won't talk to him, what makes Saul think that Samuel will tell him anything favorable? In fact, that's exactly what Samuel says in verse 16. "Why then do you ask me, since God hasn't told you anything about how to deal with your adversary?" Samuel's final rebuke to Saul in verses 16 through 19 uses the covenant name of God, Yahweh, over and over and over again to reinforce the authority behind this judgment that's coming to him. You heard me say Yahweh again and again and again. Samuel is making sure that Saul knows that this is God's judgment. This is God's realm in which he rules. And so if God says it's so, well, that's what's going to happen. And it seems that Saul is just resigned to his fate. In verse 20, it says, "Then Saul immediately fell full length upon the ground and was very afraid because of the words of Samuel. Also there was no strength in him, for he had eaten no food all day and all night. The woman came to Saul and saw that he was terrified, and said to him, 'Behold, your maidservant has obeyed you, and I have taken my life in my hand, and have listened to your words which you spoke to me. So now also please listen to the voice of your maidservant, and let me set a piece of bread before you, that you may eat and have strength when you go on your way.' But he refused, and said, 'I will not eat.' However, his servants together with the woman urged him, and he listened to them. So he arose from the ground and sat on the bed. The woman had a fattened calf in the house, and she quickly slaughtered it. She took flour, kneaded it, and baked unleavened bread from it. She brought it therefore before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they arose and went away that night." Saul's hopelessness is emphasized by everything in this sad scene. So much so that even a criminal, this medium, attempts somehow to comfort him. And Saul's helplessness is really very apparent. Everywhere he tried, there was no answer from God, right? God had departed from him a long time ago. God simply wasn't speaking to Saul anymore, because Saul had absolutely no intention of honoring God by obeying him. And of course, his fall from that position occurred a long time ago. The rebuke for Saul's arrogant disobedience that we saw way back in 1 Samuel chapter 15, it had been reaffirmed again and again and again. And now the time has finally come for its fulfillment. Remember, God promised that he was going to tear the kingdom away from Saul and give it to a neighbor who was better than he is. Of course, we know that neighbor is David. And David has shown how much better he is than Saul. And even though we have already seen where Saul has verbally affirmed that he knew that David was going to be the next king, still it must have been a tough pill to swallow. But now it seems as though all Saul can do is just wait for it to unfold. And we see here the sad results of a lifetime of rejecting God, of disobeying his will. One man put it this way. He said, "Saul had not fostered a close relationship with the legitimate means of divine communication, the prophets and priests of Yahweh, who should naturally have filled the void left by the departure of the mediums and spiritists. In fact, in Saul's irrational pursuit of David, he had killed the majority of the priests and marginalized the prophets," and we'd seen that in chapters 22 and chapter 19. When the Philistine crisis came, this current impending battle, Saul was unprepared because he had not consistently nurtured his relationship with God. He had not replaced the magicians with prophets. The trip to Endor reveals that he had not replaced his own personal reliance on magicians with a vital relationship with God. And this is an important idea to apply this text in our own lives. You see, the inconsistency of Saul may very well be our own. Our failure to consistently and regularly seek God's will and then to obey it can become our failure. James chapter 4 is helpful here. James chapter 4 talks about unanswered prayers and the reasons why sometimes it seems to us that prayer is broken. In James chapter 4, beginning in verse 1, James asks, "What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures. You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think that the Scripture speaks to no purpose? He jealously desires the Spirit which He has made to dwell in us. But He gives a greater grace. Therefore it says, God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded." I see a lot of Saul in this passage that we just read from the New Testament, James chapter 4. But I also see a lot of the fate of some Christians in here also, as they consistently fail to not only seek God's will, but when they know God's will, to apply it, to follow it, to obey it. And of course we see the consequences of such failure in the life of Saul. His life really is a sad one. I know what it was that brought about his downfall, but I still can't help feeling sorry for Saul, and wish that not only for him, but also for so many others, things would be different. And they could be. The power lies within them. God has given all of us all the resources that we need so that we can foster a close relationship with Him, and know that as long as we do that, things will be just as they ought to. David, for his part, back in 1 Samuel, we read all the way through chapter 28. We're going to read through chapter 29 now. But David, for his part now, he is truly among the enemy. He is with the Philistines. I want you to notice with me the suspicions that some of them have. We read back at the beginning of chapter 28 that the king of the city of Gath, Achish, had told David, "Hey, you're going to come down with us and you're going to help us out." And David surprisingly acquiesces. He says, "Okay, sure, I will." In chapter 29 in verse 1, it says, "Now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, while the Israelites were camping by the spring which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines were proceeding on by hundreds and by thousands. And David and his men were proceeding on in the rear with Achish. Then the commanders of the Philistines said, 'What are these Hebrews doing here?' And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, 'Is this not David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, who has been with me these days, or rather these years? And I have found no fault in him from the day he deserted to me to this day.' But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, 'Make the man go back, that he may return to his place where you have assigned him. And do not let him go down to battle with us, or in the battle he may become an adversary to us. For with what could this man make himself acceptable to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of those men, of these men? Is this not David, of whom they sang in the dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? They remember the songs that were sung of David and of his manliness, of his prowess as a warrior in battle. David enjoys Achish's confidence. And apparently it had been some time that David had been with him and had given Achish no overt reason to suspect him. Now, in earlier chapters, we read that when Achish thought David was out raiding his own people, raiding the Israelites, David was actually helping them. He was raiding other places and keeping them away from the Israelites. But Achish doesn't know that. He's got confidence in David. He thinks that the very stench of David is so odious in the nostrils of the Israelites that they would never ever take him back. That if Saul had the chance, Saul would kill David. And of course, we've seen where that's probably true. But the Philistine soldiers here are highly suspicious of David. They're suspicious of his motives. They think, what's he doing here? When we're in the heat of battle, he might turn on us. In fact, what would be a better way for him to get back in the good graces of his king than by the heads of these men, they say. And by these men, they mean their fellow soldiers, the Philistine soldiers. So these guys remember the songs that were sung about David. And don't forget this song, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s, came on the hills of David's success against Philistine battles. So they know how tough an enemy David was, as maybe even some of these men had to fight him before when he was fighting for Israel. And so they reject him. In verse 6 says, Then Achish called David and said to him, As the Lord lives, you have been upright, and your going out and your coming in with me in the army are pleasing in my sight, for I have not found evil in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, you're not pleasing in the sight of the Lord's. Now therefore return and go in peace, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines. And David said to Achish, But what have I done? And what have you found in your servant from the day when I came before you to this day, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? But Achish replied to David, I know that you are pleasing in my sight, like an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, He must not go up with us to the battle. Now then, arise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who have come up with you. And as soon as you have arisen early in the morning and have light, then depart. So David arose early, he and his men, to depart in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines. And the Philistines went up to Jezreel. The Philistines go up to fight their battle against Saul, which is going to prove disastrous for Saul and his sons, not to mention the entire army of Israel. While David returns and simply waits to see how this whole thing is going to unfold. When you look at David's reluctance to depart, it's kind of hard to understand. Surely he must have known that he would be fighting against the very king that he had before declined to harm. That he would be fighting against his own people. Or maybe he was simply putting on a show for Achish, so that Achish would have no suspicion of him. And I wondered, did David have ulterior motives? His statements could be taken in a way that Achish hadn't taken them. Look with me in verse 8 again. When David asks Achish, What have I done? And what have you found in your servant from the day when I came before you to this day, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? Who is David's lord and king? Who is he talking about? Of course, Achish probably thought he was talking about himself, that David was talking about Achish. Achish, he thought, was David's lord and king. Or was David referring to Saul, whom he had before called my lord and king? Or was he talking about the ultimate Lord and King, God? Was he planning, perhaps, if he got to that battle, to help Israel and go against the Philistines? Well, we're going to see in the next chapter that David's return is fortunate, because when he gets back to where he was staying, there's a crisis that he has to deal with. And as the Philistines march northward, David heads south to Ziklag, and a troublesome situation that we'll read about next time. But while David is among the enemy, David has been growing while Saul has been sinking. And we'll see in our final 2 chapters of 1 Samuel how Saul sinks all the way to the grave, which leaves the path open for David to become king. We hope you'll join us for that study. Thanks. God bless you.